Hey everybody, welcome to the Entrepreneur Experiment podcast with me, Gary Fox. This podcast is brought to you by Sage. Sage is the #1 provider of payroll, HR and finance software to small and medium-sized enterprises all across the globe, just like me and you. To learn more about Sage, click the link in the description below. Today, we get into the mind of one of Ireland's best investors. I sit down with Brian Caulfield and find out what it takes to be an incredible investor, but also what it takes to be an entrepreneur an investor wants to invest in. We go deep on the traits of great entrepreneurs and the traits of great businesses. Here is my chat with Brian Caulfield. Brian, welcome to the pod.
Thank you.
It is a privilege to have you here.
No, not at all. Delighted.
You are one of the leaders, I think, in the Irish startup scene. You can't think of the Irish startup scene or mention it and not think of you or get referred to you.
I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. You know?
In your case, it's good. I only hear good things. Welcome to our new studio. So we're in the Victorians building from Iconic Offices. This is our brand new studio. So you're only the third person to sit in that seat. So welcome.
Thank you. Very nice. Very nice.
Pleasure. We had a brilliant lunch. It was great to sit down and chat to you and just kind of learn from you. I think this is what I view these sessions as, like getting a new mentor every single week. And I was trying to think of where to start because it's such a multi-layered place to start with you. But I'll continue on what we were just talking about, the future of work. Mm-hmm. Like the last couple of years have been chaotic. It's quite a broad question, so take it wherever you want. What do you see as the future of work?
Well, I think so many people have already said that we're kind of headed towards more of a hybrid model, and I think that will take a little bit of time to evolve. I think people are realizing that you do need people to be in an office periodically. You know, you need to facilitate serendipity by having people together and giving them the opportunity to get to know each other in casual situations and so on. But equally, I think the days of the 5-day in the office 8 hours a day are largely gone in roles where that's possible. You know, I think we're going to see in the longer term AR and VR starting to play a big role in the world of work. That's probably a little bit further out.
Do you think that's going to happen? Because to be honest, with VR, I'm just waiting to be able to play Call of Duty on my PlayStation in VR. If that happens, I'm a happy bunny. Yeah. Do you think that we're going to sit down, pop on the goggles and have a meeting?
I do.
Okay.
Yeah. I think people are, people if you like, they came to Zoom over the period of the pandemic, and they realized that it's a great capability, and it is enabling us to potentially replace a lot of face-to-face meetings. But they also realize that there are huge flaws in the platform, and they're hungry for advances in platforms like that are going to enable more of, if you like, almost a face-to-face experience. And I think augmented reality and virtual reality will give us that in time. So yeah, I think we will see that. Like a lot of these technologies, we probably will see it adopted in gaming and entertainment.
That's what I wanted to hear. Excellent.
And that's exactly what we are seeing, really, is kind of gaming and entertainment being the place where we see these technologies deployed first. So, but I don't think we're too far away from the time where you'll put on a pair of glasses which will project a screen in front of your eyes and will project a keyboard on the table.
That far, you think?
Yeah, I think that's the kind of thing that we're going to see in probably not 5 years, but 10 years for sure.
I love when people make a bold prediction. We'll clip that and keep it on file. We'll run that back in about 5 years. You told me a mad stat there about how many flights you used to go on per year.
Yeah, I used to do 100 flights a year. I'd say I was doing about 100 flights a year for 10 years or so. They add up pretty quickly. I was traveling to London virtually every Monday morning. So if the only thing you did was go to London 50 weeks of the year, then that's 100 right there,
But like 50 times in the year, that's huge.
Yeah, I was probably in London, I'd say maybe 40 Mondays of the year, or 40. I was on the first flight to London 40 Mondays of the year. I was probably doing, maybe 6 or 8 trips to the US, and then, a few trips to Spain, a few trips to Germany, to, wherever there was an interesting deal to be done, or
So talk to me about that. What were you doing there? What were you going to London for 40, 50 times a year?
So partners meeting for Draper Esprit, as it was then, now Moulton Ventures. I joined the firm in 2010, and as a partner, firstly, it's actually interesting in terms of the conversation about Zoom and so on. The agreement I had when I started was that I would go every second week to the partners meeting, and I very quickly realized that just wasn't going to cut it, that I would need to go every week. I needed to be in the room.
It wasn't going to cut it for you or for them?
I don't think it was going to cut it for either side. I wasn't going to be happy that I was fully involved in the decision making of the organization, and equally for my partners. In those days, certainly in 2010, it was a pretty unsatisfactory experience to have one of the partners who was kind of on a voice call, a disembodied voice in the room, So I don't think it would have worked for either party,
And we talked about this earlier. It just wasn't done, I suppose. You would have been the outlier in the room. Well, you wouldn't have been in the room, but you know what I mean? You would have been the outlier. You would have been, oh, God, he's not coming again.
Exactly. And I think one of the lessons, I think of a company like Nearform that I was involved in. Nearform, very, very interesting company. At the time, it probably had maybe 40 people in Dromore in Waterford, fantastic regional success story, and 100 people around the world. And in order to make that work, they had a strict rule that they were, if you like, an online, a remote first company. So meetings were remote by definition.
When was this?
Well, I suppose I was first involved with the company maybe 6 year back.
Oh, wow. So well before everything went that direction.
Yeah, before COVID forced everybody to go that direction. So the kind of lesson that they had really, really understood is that you need to be very, very careful when you have a lot of people remote, that you don't disenfranchise them. You need to make sure that they don't feel they're being left out because they happen to be remote. And the way that you do that is by having a strategy says we're remote first. So even if people are in the same building, the meeting still takes place remotely. And I think that's very sensible. But the other side of the coin is you need to make sure that you get people together in a room periodically as well. And I think that was, certainly that was the lesson to me in my early days in Draper Esprit. If you're not in the room when decisions are being made, you're not part of the team almost.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
It's a mad journey we're on, I think, to discover this, how we're going to work. But I don't think we have any concept of how it's going to work yet. How did you get involved with Draper Esprit?
So I had been in the venture capital business for, I suppose, the best part of 10 years at that stage. I joined Trinity Venture Capital in 2002 at around the time Trinity raised its second fund. Trinity in 2007 had made a decision, firstly to go public, but also to move in a slightly different direction and become a kind of a holding company with a small number of large investments. And the first investment that they made as a public company was a chain of 11 hotels. I would be a complete liar if I told you that I knew kind of presciently that an investment in a chain of 11 hotels was a really bad idea in 2007. But for me, you know, I'm a tech guy. I'm originally a computer engineer. My entire career has been in the technology area. So it just really wasn't what I wanted to do or what I was interested in doing. So I left Trinity Venture Capital at that stage, initially with a plan that I was going to raise my own fund. I briefly actually did an interim CEO role in one of the portfolio companies for about 8 months. And then in 2008, I kind of started down the track of putting together a team and trying to raise a fund myself.
Nice timing.
Exactly, as I kind of quickly realized, Jesus Christ himself could not have raised a first-time venture capital fund in 2008.
JC Capital.
Yeah. So I was then approached by the guys in Draper Esprit. I knew some of the team pretty well there. And they had raised a fund, but they were interested in expanding the fund and were interested in seeing if they could raise some capital in the Irish market. And essentially the deal was, if we're successful in raising capital in the Irish market, there's a seat for you at the table. And ultimately we raised about $50 million from what's now ISIF, the Ireland Strategic Investment Fund. About a third of that went into DFJ 10 in the United States, the Draper Fisher Jervitz, and the balance went into our European fund. And that was really kind of the entry point for me. And you know, in many respects, I feel like it was a great step up because it moved me from being, if you like, exclusively an Irish market-focused investor to a much broader European focus.
Was that a big change, though? Was that a mindset change?
I don't think it was really a mindset change. I think I'd been very fortunate in Trinity Venture Capital that the CEO of Trinity Venture Capital, John Tracy, was actually a great mentor in a lot of ways, and I think he built a very strong team in Trinity Venture Capital, and they're all people that I still keep in contact with. So I don't think that there was much of a shift in terms of the basic mechanics of what you're trying to do or the sorts of relationships that you're trying to build with entrepreneurs. Probably more than anything else, it meant more air miles for sure.
That's where it all started. Okay.
You know, a broader remit and, you know, the ability to write bigger checks and all of those kind of things. So it was certainly a step up, but I don't think it was really a fundamental change.
For people that are completely unfamiliar with venture capital, what is it to the layman on the street?
So I suppose in a nutshell, it's about financing early stage innovation, early stage startup companies. It's obviously high risk, high return. What you're hoping to do, you'll often hear it described as kind of you're hoping to invest in the next Google. You know, personally, I hate that because there's only one Google on the entire planet, and the odds on you finding the next Google in Dublin are pretty low. But there's lots of other great companies. So, you know, if you think of one of my most successful investments was a company called Movidius, which was a chip company. And Movidius went for almost 10 years without revenue developing their product.
Oh, wow.
And then the revenues went $1 million, 10 million, 40 million, you know.
So there were 10 years developing the tech.
10 years developing the tech and kind of continuing to refine the tech. And I mean, one of the big challenges about semiconductor in particular, if you think of it this way, you know, you're designing a chip, which takes a long time, and bringing the chip to production. And then somebody has to design your chip into a consumer product.
Okay.
You know,
what was the chip for?
So the chip was to enable computer vision capabilities in battery-powered devices at the edge of the network, right?
I'm looking at you blankly, so I'm hoping you're going to fill that in for me.
Indeed. So if you think of mobile phones and devices like that, they're battery powered. So you need to make sure that the power consumption of any device that goes into a phone is extremely low. They're also small physically, so the device, the chip needs to be very, very small and efficient in that respect. And I suppose what the founders of Movidius realized is there's going to be a real desire to put computer vision capabilities into those type of devices.
Okay.
So, you know, having a capability in your mobile phone, not only to take video, but to analyze that video and identify objects in the video and all of those kind of things. Now, the interesting thing is that when the guys came up with the concept originally, it's probably fair to say that they didn't fully understand what the first applications would be. So for example, the first product that generated big revenues for Movidius was consumer drones, and the chips were being used to give those consumer drones visual collision avoidance, right? And GPS denied hovering, so we can hover even if we don't have GPS access, right? Now, if you had asked the guys kind of 10, 11 years earlier, would there be cheap consumer drones? They'd probably have said no. Never.
That's what I was going to... I mean, literally, my next question was like, how do you see 10 years into the future? Because I'm always fascinated by these companies that work on something for so long. And like, it's almost like they're glimpsing the future. Obviously, they're not. But how did they just had belief in the industry, or how did they keep going for 10 years?
Well, they knew that there were lots of interesting emerging applications of computer vision, right? Enabling computers to understand the world visually is an incredibly useful thing to be able to do.
Yeah.
So you know, there were emerging technologies in that space. And the next leap then is to kind of say, that's great. Wouldn't it be fantastic if we could put those kind of capabilities into devices that are at the edge of the network, and that that are going to be battery powered and so on. And that brings with it a whole set of kind of consequences which really drive the engineering approach. For example, as I said, there's a limited battery power. The device has to be physically small. The other big thing, though, was that it actually turns out that for a lot of applications that are visual, I mean, if I think of automated driving, for example, you can't waste tens of milliseconds shipping all the data to the cloud to have it analyzed in the cloud and then have an answer come back. You know, the time that takes is just too great. And not only is the time that it takes too great, but the carbon footprint of doing that is very, very high. So they understood that there's going to be a need to be able to do that processing locally on the device, not just up in the cloud. And that's where the opportunity lies, to create the device to specifically meet that need.
I want to ask you a very quick question. I want to ask you another question about Movidius in a second, but I want to ask you, you touched on it there, driverless cars. It's coming or no?
It's coming, but not as quickly as we might have thought at one stage. But yes, it's coming, and I think there's a huge, let's say, sociological problem there, because when a driverless car kills somebody, there will be outrage, and there'll be weeping and gnashing of teeth. And people will forget about the 10,000 people that weren't killed because of driverless cars, So there's a big, if you like, social acceptance issue or around technologies like this. I think the basic technology is pretty much there. There are some kind of enhancements, but acceptance of the technology will take longer than I think people might have envisaged.
What would be your prediction for driverless cars on the road? I know they're in certain test cases, but let's say, okay, you're leaving me here now in 45 minutes, you're heading home, you're going to hop in a taxi. When is that going to be driverless?
Probably 20 years.
Yeah.
Probably 20 years.
Yeah, I think that's the reality. I think it's like VR and any of these things. They come immediately and then don't come again for the next 10, 15 years. You're like, oh, this is going to be this great new thing. And you're like, everyone gets excited. And then there's this lull when you're like, oh, it's not here yet.
Yeah.
And then there's
absolutely.
like, oh, it's overblown, blah, 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 blah. But it was even that social bias about the driverless cars. There was that horrific accident in the UK during the week. And the headline was, a woman crashes into a train line after collision with Tesla. What happened was they were going 120 mile an hour, lost control of the car, flipped over a barrier, hit a parked Tesla,
right,
and then kept going. Yeah. And in the headline, after collision with Tesla, and it's just like there's a massive social bias there. It's scary. Yeah. Only the footage then emerged. Tesla had the CCTV on all the different angles.
Yeah,
and they're like, well, this is actually what happened. Like a tragic story, but again, it just highlights your point. Movidius.
Yep.
How did you realize that was a good investment?
So I think one of the things about venture capital is you do from time to time have to be prepared to make a kind of a leap of faith and to kind of say, I believe in this market opportunity, and I believe in the ability of this team to make it happen. I had actually brought Movidius to our investment committee, to our partners meeting 3 times, and each time the kind of the product that was likely to be the first source of big revenues changed. Like at one stage, okay, the guys felt that the first product that they'd get mass adoption with was kind of 3D television. Yeah. And then it was advances to cameras in mobile phones and very sophisticated cameras in mobile phones. And then it was, the low price consumer drones. I always believed in the overall market opportunity. I believed in the ability of the team. I mean, Dave Maloney and Sean Mitchell and John Burke, really, really great guys, great entrepreneurs, hugely committed to what they were doing. I have no doubt that the third time I brought it to the investment committee, I'm sure my partners were there thinking, I do not believe he's talking about this fucking company again.
Just let him do it. Just let him have it. We're going to write this one off as a bad investment. Just shut him up.
Well, actually, I got lucky, because on that third occasion, there was a guy called Hongshuan Zhang from Robert Bosch Venture Capital in the room. They were one of our LP investors. And Hongshuan was I guess he was kind of almost interning with us for a period of time. And Robert Bosch, as you know, have a huge automotive electronics business. And Hongshuan kind of said, oh, this sounds really interesting. And ultimately, Hongshuan came into the investment. Robert Bosch Venture Capital invested alongside us.
Okay.
And we co-led with Atlantic Bridge. But I think if Hong Xuan had not been there, that was the thing that kind of got my partners over the line, where they sort of said, oh, maybe Brian isn't a complete lunatic after all. And there is something in this. And I think that kind of reflects one of the things I've learned over the years. There's a hell of a lot of luck in
I literally wrote that down as my next question. I've here luck ? Written down on my thing. What role does that play? Because it's not talked about. And I think there's an element of entrepreneurs definitely do this. I think we all do this. We retroactively fit the narrative.
Yes.
We go back and go, well, when I think about it now, I obviously knew blah, 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 exit for 15 million.
Yeah. I mean, I think the first thing is that kind of, life isn't like that. And I've always been very, very suspicious with people who have this narrative, either retrospectively or even up front, where they have this incredibly detailed plan. I'm going to graduate from Trinity, and then I'm going to do 2 years with an investment bank, and then I'm going to go back and do my MBA, and I'm going to work for McKinsey for 2 years, and then I'm going to start my first company. And life just isn't like that. And I'm always reminded of a story that a professor in the Stanford Graduate School of Business used to tell, and it was about his own son. And his son had been a junior professor in Stanford and had then moved to Carnegie Mellon in Pittsburgh. And, his CV sort of said that he got a fantastic opportunity at Carnegie Mellon to pursue his core research interests. And he'd moved there and had been very successful with publications and had had the opportunity to move up to full professor. And, the whole CV is that kind of retrospective justification. And as the guy used to say, what his CV should have said was, moved to Pittsburgh for a girl, And that's what actually happens in
That's life, though. We always think life is going to be this gradual uptick. Everything's just going to get slightly better all the time, and we're going to progress nicely along this curve, this upward curve. Life's going to get better, when in reality it's these spikes.
Yeah.
Peaks, troughs, peaks, troughs, peaks, troughs. Like, you just can't account for life. I think sometimes I admire people like that. I'm like, well, you know what you're going to do. You have to have some vision, right? You have to have some level of, you know what, I'm not going to flow through life like some sort of hoping everything's going to be fine. You need to balance, though. And I think that's what people, I'm the same when I look at people go, I'm admiring your ambition here, but equally, I think experience. So we talked about this over lunch. It's very hard without the experience of certain things to understand what's going to happen, because you can't.
Yeah, I mean, I think so often. I think actually often as you get older, you sort of a little bit discount the value of your own experience, because it becomes so sort of built in.
It just is.
So
it's just there.
So latent, I frequently be surprised where I might say something about, the world of investment and so on, and somebody says, God, that's so insightful. And I'm sort of like, doesn't everybody know this? And the reality is, of course, they don't.
But when you get deep, and as you said, as you go more and more into your life and more into your career, it just becomes assumed knowledge, because more than likely you're hanging out with people like that. You're hanging out with people of a level. You're hanging out with people that just become second nature. Yeah. And then you move out of that spectrum, and suddenly it's, big fish, small pond. Sometimes it's like, oh yeah, look, I know it all. Talk to me about luck a little bit more, though, because in your career as a VC, luck is one thing, but what about the traits in entrepreneurs? What do you've built up, I'd imagine, pattern recognition. What are the traits you look for, regardless of the idea? What are the traits of an entrepreneur?
So I suppose the first thing is that I think most really, really good entrepreneurs have huge commitment to kind of solving the problem, if you like. And, I think most great entrepreneurs actually aren't particularly motivated by money. They're, as I sometimes say, they're grumpy people who see something being done badly and kind of say to themselves, there's got to be a better way. I cannot believe this is so shit. and they want to fix it. And sometimes it may be a very, very personal motivation. You know, it may be something in their childhood or in their family life that really drives them to look to address a kind of a particular problem. So I'm definitely looking for that rather than somebody who's just all about counting the money kind of thing. I also really want to be involved with people that I believe that I can have a kind of a strong, constructive relationship with, you know, people who demonstrate integrity, people who demonstrate openness and honesty, because the kind of the type of relationship that I want to build with an entrepreneur is a relationship whereby, you know, if the shit hits the fan, actually I'm the first call that they want to make. And they know, you know, they know when they tell me things have gone horribly wrong, that I'm going to go, shit, you know. But then I'm going to move to...
They're not hiding it from you. They're coming to you.
They're not hiding it
for help. Yeah, they're not trying to...
And they're coming to me because they know that I will say, damn, shit, what, you know, that's a pain. But that then I'll move to, okay, what do we need to do to address this? What are the steps that we need to take immediately? What are the things we need to do longer term, you know? And that I'll be, if you like, solution focused. You know, how do we deal with this, you know? So I want to identify people that I believe I'm going to be able to have that kind of relationship with. You're also ideally looking for people who have a kind of a unique insight into the market opportunity, you know, who are saying to you, you know, this is a huge market opportunity, and this is where everybody is getting it wrong. You know,
the secret, the unique sauce.
This is the little secret sauce that's going to enable us to succeed in this market. I think hustle is also a huge factor. Like, I'm frequently shocked at the number of people that I will meet where I'll make an offer to introduce them to somebody, and they say, yeah, that'd be great, and I never hear from them again. You know, I love it can be a pain in the ass, but I love when I meet an entrepreneur and I sort of say to them, oh, you should really talk to so and so. And, you know, the next morning I have an email from them saying, you know, you said you'd introduce me to, and it'd be really great if you could do that, you know. So that kind of hustle, I think is, I mean, it's an incredibly important characteristic of an entrepreneur anyway, but you like to see that demonstrated. You like to see
the follow through, and because it's a big offer for you to open up your network. Probably the most valuable thing you have outside of your material portfolio. It's your most valuable asset, that network, because you are giving them your glow. You are introing, going, on the basis of this, I'm introing you to this person.
Yeah.
It's like, it's a hugely valuable thing.
Yeah, I guess.
So integrity, focus on the problem, unique insight, and hustle. They're the four traits you'd always look for in an entrepreneur. And then flipping that on its head, what do you look for in an investment, in a company? What are the things? I know some of them will overlap a little, but what are the companies that you look at and go, yeah?
Yeah, well, the huge part of it obviously is the people involved in the company. But I think the most fundamental thing of all is the kind of the big unsolved problem, the large market opportunity that's out there. And I think when people are pitching to investors, the number one thing that they should be trying to communicate is, what is the big unsolved problem? Because if you can convince me that there's a big unsolved problem, then I'm interested in the how. How do you solve this problem? I'm interested in the who. You know, I think who is the team that's behind this. I'm not really interested in the who and the how if you haven't convinced me about the existence of the opportunity up front, you know. So I always say to people, like, sell the problem, not the solution, right? And
all the great companies do that, though.
They
When you look at great marketing,
yeah, absolutely.
it's not. It's like the old iPod thing. It's not like has 2 gigs of RAM.
Yeah,
I was trying to explain that to students recently. I was like, don't keep saying what it does for you. What does it do for them?
Yeah.
1,000 songs in your pocket. It's one of the best marketing examples. I know using Apple is a complete cliche, but it's true.
Yeah.
X gigs of RAM means nothing. 1,000 songs in your pocket. Perfect.
We used to occasionally talk about, we might meet an entrepreneur at an event or something, and, as partners, we'd be talking about it and say, yeah, he came up and he vomited features all over me. And that just doesn't work as a tactic, because when you meet somebody for the first time, your objective is to get a meeting, right? And absolutely to get that meeting, it's all about convincing them that there's this big unsolved problem, and ideally that you have a unique insight into that big unsolved problem.
The excitement overtakes them in the moment, and
Absolutely.
they're just like, "This is the best problem." We were talking about stealth mode companies earlier. Kind of falls into that category of like either being too secretive or just being over the top as to why it's the best. So the biggest traits you look for is the big unsolved problem.
Yeah,
the big market to tackle.
Big market opportunity. Yeah. I think that's and then, as I said, the people are hugely important. Technology probably comes a distant third.
Interesting.
Because if you've got really, really good people in a really big market opportunity, you'll fix the tech. You'll figure the tech out.
It's so funny you say that, because literally 3 hours ago, someone sat in that chair and told us that exact story. And it was Mark from And Open. And that was exactly their story.
Yep.
They had a great idea, suddenly a huge untapped market. They had the people, didn't have the tech.
Yeah, and I have to say, I'm an investor in And Open, and it's one of the companies that I'm an investor in that I'm most excited about. I think
I can see why.
It's a great company. But the other thing is that And Open has quite a unique perspective on the problem.
Yes.
And quite a unique aesthetic. And I think that actually comes from the people that are involved in the business.
You could tell that from them. It was such an interesting chat. It's so design focused. They're approaching it from a design narrative. It's always about the provenance. It's almost about the design. They just had a totally different perspective. From me, prior to meeting them, I'm like, oh, the logistics in this must be really tough, and this must be really tough. But then he stripped it back and was like, no, this is how it started.
Yeah.
The logistics and stuff's easy. It's all the other intangible stuff behind it.
Yeah.
And it's a beautiful story. It's funny, that serendipity thing we talked about earlier. The fact that he was there 3 hours ago, now you're here. It's brilliant. I love that. Was there ever a big miss? Was there ever one? I'll two different questions, same theme. Was there ever one you didn't invest in, and you're like, oh no? Three years later, you open up the Irish Times or open up the Currency, and you're like, oh no.
So that's an easy question to answer. Like, my big miss was Intercom, and I knew the guys. I knew Owen reasonably well. I chatted to Owen about the business. At the time, they were extremely early stage, and I was quite new in Draper Esprit at the time. And I was kind of saying to Owen, like, you're kind of too early stage, and I just wouldn't get it across. I love what you're doing, but I just wouldn't get it across the line with my partners. And actually, when Owen moved to California, I introduced him to some friends of mine there. At least one of those friends invested in the business and owes me big time, right? But
I'm kind of giggling nervously thinking about the opportunity of Intercom and missing it.
Yeah, and I think, I think probably their seed round was probably done at like $8 million pre-money or something like that.
Yeah.
But a very, very modest valuation, maybe even less. I was probably right because, I think the other partners, when you join a venture capital firm, there's a period during which your partners need to get comfortable with your business judgment. And I think if it had been 2 years later, I would have been able to say to my partners, look, guys, this is a huge opportunity and we need to just do this deal,
That's interesting because that circles back to the point of luck and timing.
Yeah,
2 years
absolutely.
later, you would have had proven yourself, you would have had that credibility. You kind of could have went, look, I'm taking out a chip here, I'm going to cash it in. This is going to be my one for the year. I'm going to take this one.
Yeah.
And then the paths diverge. And then was there one where you kind of you really thought it was going to be an absolute? You don't have to name them, obviously, but was there one where you were fully convinced I'm all in on this one, and then it turns out completely different?
Yeah, I mean, and again, I don't have a problem naming it, and I'm sure the guys wouldn't have a problem either. I would put DataHug very much into that category. We did ultimately get a successful exit for DataHug, but it wasn't the kind of the big number that we were all hoping for. And I think, if I look back on it now, I think DataHugs had some incredibly clever technology and had identified a really interesting flaw, if you like, in a lot of systems that process relationships, which was they knew that you and I have a relationship, but they have no idea what the strength of that relationship is. Or is that a one-way relationship or a relationship that runs in both directions and that kind of thing? And, the fundamental concept was the ability to sort of quality score a relationship is a very, very useful thing to be able to do. But initially, I think the company struggled to verticalize that to solve a very specific problem for a very specific group of people.
Even as you're describing it to me, and I'm familiar with DataHug, but even as you're describing it to me, my brain is kind of going, that's such an intangible, and it can be very difficult to quantify. And for who gets the most value out of it? It's applicable. We talked about this at lunch. It's a very broad market they could potentially go after.
Yeah. And to be honest, LinkedIn should have bought that company. LinkedIn should have bought it. And if you look at LinkedIn, even today, LinkedIn has no real idea of the strength of relationship between two people who are connected on LinkedIn. That would be incredibly valuable, and it's still not there. And we did talk to LinkedIn, but I think at the time there was very much a kind of a not invented here kind of mindset in LinkedIn. We ended up verticalizing the technology as a kind of a CRM enhancement, which would help us to predict the likelihood of closing deals in your pipeline based on the strength of the relationship with key parties in the transaction. And we were kind of successfully selling that. But we'd been through a couple of iterations in the business and it was getting harder to raise money. So I absolutely believe that it was the right thing to exit the business. But it was definitely a business where we thought, this has so much more potential. Probably the other one in very recent times, an angel investment of mine in a company called Robotify. And, in the case of Robotify, two very, very young entrepreneurs. I think when I met the guys first, they might have been 20, And when we sold the company, I think they were just turned 23, That company, I feel, had tremendous potential, a lot of work to do because obviously a very inexperienced team, but had the potential to go much further. But, when you're 23 and you come from, not a wealthy background in Dublin and an acquirer shows up and offers to make you a millionaire, you can absolutely understand how somebody says, you know what,
That's a hard offer to turn down.
That's a hard offer to turn down.
That really is.
But it's one of those cases where you sort of feel, God, there was so much potential there. Now I think the founders will go on at some point to do something else, and I can absolutely recognize how for them at the time, it was a decision that made sense for them. But you do sort of say, God, that could have gone so much further.
That's interesting. That's something I'd never thought of. Because you always read, exited for this and exited for that and blah, blah, blah. But you don't actually think, was that the right time? You don't think that, because I think sometimes the right time is when you can, right? I think it depends on what stage you're at. If you're a first-time founder, talk to me about second-time founders, because you just alluded to it there. Second-time founders, what's your thoughts? Because obviously Adam Neumann is all over the news at the minute for his 350 million raise, and people have varying insights. So give me a hot take on that.
Yeah, well, sort of, if you like, my hot take on Adam Neumann is that, frankly, he's shown himself to be a pretty disreputable character in a lot of ways. And if I was Mark Andreessen, that is not a deal I would have done.
So you would not do it?
I would not do that. But I think that that's a very special case, and I think backing experienced entrepreneurs is generally a good thing to be doing. I mean, a classic example for me would have been Jerry Samuels in mobile travel technologies. He had already built a business which was one of the very early internet booking engines for flights. And I hadn't been an investor in that business, but I knew the business, and Jerry's business partner, Stuart Coulson, was a good friend of mine. So I knew Jerry, and it was interesting because it was another scenario where my partners were kind of saying to me, well, there's a lot of services in this business. And
what was he trying to build?
So essentially a platform for airlines for a whole range of mobile services. So everything from like booking your flight on your mobile phone to last minute business class upgrades and meals and all that kind of thing, but with a really, really beautiful mobile experience, and they were hoping that they'd be able to move to a transactional model where they'd take a slice of all revenue going through the platform. But at the stage where we were making our investment, essentially each installation of the product for another major customer, involved a lot of services, customizing the platform for them. And, I remember trying to explain to my partners, look, I absolutely guarantee you we will make money from this deal.
It's a bold statement.
Right? If we are successful in transitioning to the transactional model, this could be really, really huge. If we're not, we'll still make 3 times our money, right? This was a business that was, already growing revenues and doing well. And Jerry was just a great entrepreneur, really hard driving entrepreneur, a tough guy to work for sure, but a really, really good entrepreneur. And we didn't manage to get the transactional model off the ground for reasons that I won't bore you with, but we made 5 times our money in 3 years.
Okay.
So that was,
your prediction was nearly bang on.
It wasn't far wrong. That's for sure.
I want to ask you a little bit more about second-time founders in a second, but the Adam Neumann thing, why did he back him in your case? I know you can't get inside of Mark Andreessen's head, but why do you think he backed him with that much money?
I would say he thinks that he's a very compelling entrepreneur. I think he did have a vision for the WeWork business, and I think Mark Andreessen has said publicly that he feels that Adam Neumann kind of reinvented a market. Personally, I think that's a stretch. I mean, it's easy to reinvent a market with a completely unsustainable business model, giving...
It's like giving free money. It's a great idea, but not sustainable.
Giving free food out on the street is definitely going to kind of reinvent the supermarket model, but it's only going to last so long, So I think that's probably a stretch. But... I think it's also perhaps of the moment, in the sense that I think there is a trend at the moment for VCs in the US in particular, especially the larger VCs who've raised very, very large sums of money, to increasingly look for, if you like, asset-based businesses, where maybe the upside isn't going to be as great, but the downside is going to be a lot less,
yes.
And also where they can deploy very large amounts of capital into those businesses,
I think of the moment is a very good point, because probably 12 months ago, so I remember reading an article, big Financial Times inside interview with Adam, and at the end of the piece, the journalist just wrote, Adam never followed up with what the actual idea was going to be. And they'd done about 3,000 words.
Yeah.
And like throughout it, you could see the journalist was trying to signal going, he's not revealing anything. He's not revealing any. Yeah, he's just talking at me. He's just talking at me. And at the end, it's like, he failed to follow up with what the actual idea. And he was like saying, this is going to be revelatory. So you got 3,000 words on nothing really tangible. But it's fascinating. So second-time founders, was that something you steered towards? Was that something you'd look as an indicator for?
No, I mean, I think I'm very happy to back first-time founders, and if I think of the Robotify guys, not only were they first-time founders, but they were also incredibly young, and both sort of still in college at the time that I first met them. But if you've got a second-time founder or a second-time founder team, then I think the likelihood is that you're going to be prepared to think about, writing a bigger check, and you'll definitely see it as a less risky bet, where you're dealing with people who are a known quantity, I suppose, as much as anything.
I talked to you about your worst investments. It's only fair I asked you about your best one.
Yeah, well, I suppose in an Irish context, Movidius was a fantastic investment. And actually, when Movidius was sold, I wasn't aware of this at the time, but it was the largest ever private sale of an Irish venture-backed company.
Oh, wow.
When it was acquired by Intel.
When was that?
That was in 2016.
Wow, incredible.
It's probably been bypassed since. I'm not sure, but it was a fantastic outcome and a great return. We'd only been invested in the business for 3 years, even though the business had been on the go for about 13 altogether. So that would be one. I mean, the other portfolio company that hopefully is someday going to have an enormous exit is a company called Graphcore, which is an AI chip. That's a Bristol-based company. Graphcore, yeah. It's raised hundreds of millions of dollars and is valued in the billions. So that was my first unicorn.
Okay.
My first unicorn investment. Hasn't got to exit yet. I mean, they're not actively looking for an exit. But, that, if you like, is an NVIDIA killer. And NVIDIA is a very, very valuable business. So that hopefully will prove successful ultimately.
Talk to me about the Irish ecosystem. I think it's changed a lot in the last 10, 15 years. You're heavily involved in the ecosystem. I hinted that at the very first sentence I spoke on the pod.
Yeah.
You do Scale Ireland, you do a number of different ventures. Talk to me about the ecosystem as it is and kind of tell me where you'd like it to go.
So, I mean, the first thing I'd say is that I'm obviously fantastically positive on the ecosystem. I mean, I started my first business in 1992, so literally 30 years ago now, and I just cannot begin to explain how much more vibrant the ecosystem is now, how much deeper the pools of capital that are available are. You know, there's an awful lot of really, really good things have happened, and there's a phenomenal cohort of experienced talent, both entrepreneurs and kind of technical and marketing and sales talent, which kind of really didn't exist 30 years ago. I mean, I remember I was involved in what at the time was called the Irish Software Association, and we decided we'd have a dinner. And I think we struggled to get 30 people in a room for that, and the equivalent now is sort of sold out in the biggest ballroom in the city.
I'm sure, yeah.
So fantastic expansion, lots of great and talented people. But we still have a few fairly important problems. We don't have the level of access that we need to have to very early stage capital. Early stage capital needs to be, ideally there needs to be a lot of it, but it also needs to be fast,
When you say early stage, numbers wise, what are you talking?
I suppose we're talking about, amounts of up to a couple of million, that kind of thing, but also the very early stage angel checks where it might be just a few 100,000, that kind of thing. We don't really have a very active angel capital market in Ireland. That's partly because the incentives that we have for angel investment, by comparison with, for example, the UK, are still very, very weak. There have been some improvements made, but still they are relatively weak. It's really helpful if you want to build a successful ecosystem if the first capital comes from individual angels rather than institutions. Institutions, by their nature, take time to make decisions.
Okay, yeah.
Whereas if you're investing your own money, you can make decisions very, very quickly, right? And you can choose to invest very, very early without many proof points. And if you look at successful ecosystems around the world, the vast majority of the early capital going into businesses goes in from individual angels rather than institutions. So that's one big area that I think we need to improve. The other is access to skills and talent, and this is a global problem. The kind of the war for talent, if you like. As I say, the war for talent is over and talent won, So it's incredibly important that we can attract talent, not just from, within Ireland, but from abroad. And there's a number of things that are causing problems there. I mean, the first these days is probably housing, which is obviously a huge problem in terms of your ability to attract people from abroad. But secondly, you need to make joining an early stage technology company attractive from a risk perspective.
I think that's huge. Yeah.
And today it's not. If you do get share options, if they ultimately pay off, you're almost certainly going to pay full income tax on those share options. And that just doesn't make sense, especially when you could join a large tech company where there's infinitely more certainty around the value of your options or your restricted stock award or whatever it happens to be. So you're not really taking a risk, you know. That's just like,
you see, they walk through the door in Grand Canal, the golden handcuffs go on, and then
absolutely
they ain't breaking off. I just see it, you know. It's human nature. Your cost of living goes up. You buy nicer things. You go on nicer holidays. You're earning maybe $150 a year. You know, there's a lot of big companies in Ireland, which is good. But I'm seeing more and more. I'm seeing a talent drain away from the entrepreneurial scene into bigger companies.
Yeah, and it's
especially after COVID. I noticed there was a little tipping point there for about 2 months, and my LinkedIn was just full of people going, "Delighted to announce I'm joining the rock stars at insert X generic company name here," and you're like, "Oh no, they were building something cool."
Yeah, and you can understand that in the sense that, you know, people do want financial security and so on. The flip of that, by the way, is that it's incredibly difficult to attract a talented person, you know, from Google or from Twitter or from these companies, because if you are a reasonably senior executive in Google or Facebook or whatever, then, you know, that's equivalent to a decent founder exit.
Yeah, that's the thing, right?
Probably over a slightly longer time span.
But after you've paid your tax, and after you've got,
it might take you 10 years or whatever, but with a much, much higher degree of certainty, you know? So it's very, very difficult to take somebody who's in that position and you know, say to them, "Come and join us. We're going to pay you half what Google pays you. We're going to give you a bunch of stock options, which might be utterly worthless. And by the way, you're probably going to pay full income tax on those share options."
But it's a Dublin bike card. We'll give you Dublin bike cards
as
your perk. Yeah. If you had a magic wand and you could just change a couple of things about the Irish ecosystem right now, no matter how big or small, what would they be to make the Irish startup ecosystem better?
I'd radically reform the keep share option scheme so that firstly there's no link between salary and the level of options that you can grant, and so that you effectively guarantee that people will pay capital gains tax on share option gains.
As opposed to income.
I would also extend that to advisors, because, you know, as things stand today, you have to be working more or less full time for a startup to benefit from the keep share option scheme. But actually, you know, advisors who are maybe only working a couple of days a month with the company can have an enormous impact on the success of those businesses. And we want to give people incentives to say, yeah, you know what, I'll become a non-exec director of that business. I'll get involved. I'll try to help the business. So those two things. You know, I'd also focus a lot on making our visa processes, going back to the issue of talent, an awful lot easier to navigate. I used to joke years ago, and you know, it still holds true. I would give the people in the offices of the IDA and Enterprise Ireland around the world books of tear-off visas, you know, and if you have the skills that we need, we can, you know, write it out.
You get a visa, and you get a visa, and you get a visa.
Yeah, and just make it really user-friendly, and you know, promise people that once you come to Ireland, you can bring your family, your partner can work, you know, we're going to make it really easy for you, and you'll never have to queue up outside that awful place on the quays.
Oh, it's just awful. Yeah. I remember the first morning I drove past it, I was like, what's everyone queuing up for? And then it used to be on my way to work, and I'd see it every single day, and I was like, that is, and they'd be there, I'd be going to work super early, so it might be like 7, and it might be 2 blocks over. You're like, my God, and it's in the milling rain. Like, it's just, it's crazy. Like, you talked about the war for talent and the talent won, but now you see companies engaging in the war. They're like Portugal.
Yes.
They're like, okay, let's go after it. Like, we're going to go after it, because you see the likes of Bali and blah, blah, blah going after it. But Portugal are the first company, or first country I've seen where I'm like, oh, they're really properly thinking about this.
Well, I think the other great example would be Estonia.
Yes.
And actually the Baltic countries generally have taken a very, very, proactive approach. Also Spain, Spain is, I don't know if they've actually implemented it yet, but they're planning a startup law essentially, which is going to enhance the environment there. So we do need to be conscious that a lot of our competitor countries, are really doubling down on the kind of the startup environment. If you look at the UK, the incentives for angel investment there through the EIS system are just absolutely phenomenal. Even after a reform of the system, about £2 billion a year is invested in the UK through that scheme. That's equivalent to the guts of a couple of 100 million euros here, and we're nowhere near that level of early stage angel investment. I think the other thing that Europe generally needs to think about is, how do we drive the venture capital market? Because one of the issues in Europe is that a lot of the big investors in venture capital in the US don't exist here. So, for example, if you think of the big university endowments, the Stanford endowment, they invest huge amounts in venture capital. That market just doesn't exist in Europe. So we need to find other sources of capital for the European venture firms. So encouraging pension funds, for example, to invest in venture capital, I think is important as well, So I suppose those would be probably the kind of the big things, As I said, we've seen some changes in the EIS scheme. I think the approach of the government will be to see, what the impact of those changes is before we make further changes. But I'd like to see, if you like, I'd love to see government just be a little bit more radical in terms of its approach to this.
I think it needs a radical approach. Otherwise, we just become a haven for big companies, which is great, provides a lot of employment, but it then will stifle the startup ecosystem. Just a few final questions for you. The last one's going to be a book to recommend, so you can have a little think on that as we're going through. What advice would you give to an entrepreneur starting in 2022? Because a lot's changed in the last couple of years. What kind of couple of bits of advice would you give an entrepreneur brand new, just about to start? What would be the fundamentals you'd say to focus on?
Well, I think the first thing is that the funding market is going to be a little tougher for the next couple of years than it has been. The markets have turned, and I think you should be prepared for a lot of hustle and to really, really focus on revenue early on, so the days of, if you like, growth at any cost and we'll always be able to raise more money are kind of gone. So you need to really, really focus on, how can we prove the economic viability of our proposition, focus on revenue, focus on customers. What else would I say? I think sometimes Enterprise Ireland gets a bum rap, but I think by comparison with the development agencies in almost any other country, they actually do a fantastic job. So I think you should engage with them early on. You're going to have to do some work. You're going to have to fill in some forms, but suck it up. Do it, because apart from their ability to help you with obviously funding, there are a lot of other supports that you will have access to once you're kind of inside, once you're inside the fold. But I think probably the most fundamental thing is, really focus on getting to revenue early, really focus on maintaining a very, very lean operation, doing as much as you possibly can with as little as you possibly can, you know. And I think that's going to be the recipe for sort of at least a couple of years, just because of the type of funding environment.
And it's funny, you always see big companies start in a recession, and I think that's a part of the reason, right? You know, they get better, they get stronger, because they have to be. Yeah. They have to come out stronger. They can't just rely on this endless funds of cash and we'll get the business model later. We'll just get customers or audience or reach, whatever nonsense metric you want to put on it. Yep. I think that's crucial. Second last question before we ask you about the book. What areas are interesting to you right now?
Well, I think we've actually already been talking about one of the most interesting areas, which is kind of the future of work and how that's going to pan out. So I'm very interested in, and I'm an investor in Boundless, which is essentially a platform to enable companies to kind of employ anyone, anywhere in a completely compliant way.
That's a no-brainer. That's just a complete no-brainer.
Absolutely. And I've been an investor there for several years, but I think, you know, the pandemic will accelerate that trend for sure. Similarly, I'm an investor in a company called Inclusio, which is building a platform to enable organizations to manage diversity and inclusion. And I think platforms of that nature are going to be hugely important, because there is a desire for people to see the companies that they work for walk the walk as well as talk the talk, you know. And, you know, how are you going to be able to demonstrate that you really are walking the walk if you don't have systems to actually manage diversity?
There's no point having it on the About Us page, and it's just like
exactly
clip art or generic image here. It's nothing worse.
Exactly. So I think that's kind of an area generally that I'm very interested in. And as we were saying earlier, you know, lots of companies have tried to crack recruitment. Recruitment's incredibly badly broken. I'm not sure why nobody has really managed to crack it, but if somebody does, that's just an absolutely enormous market opportunity, you know. So I'd love to find a company that I felt really had something special.
All the recruitment companies listening are now suddenly going, okay, I'm going to send an email to him later.
Yeah.
What book has made an impact on you, or books have made an impact on you personally or professionally?
So the book that I normally recommend in this situation is a book called How We Know What Isn't So. And the subtitle is
Sounds like a kid's book.
Well, it's definitely not that. The subtitle is The Fallibility of Human Reason in Everyday Life.
There we go. They've managed to get it in the subheading.
It's by a guy called Tom Gilovich, and I would describe it as being a kind of a much easier to read and more useful version of Thinking Fast and Slow.
That was hard work.
That's hard work.
That's hard work.
That's really hard
I thought
work.
that was like, because I saw the review and I was like, oh, that sounds really interesting. And I'm like, oh, it's like reading a scientific paper.
Well, read Gilovich, because Gilovich...
How We Know What Isn't So.
Yeah. And Gilovich is actually referenced several times by Daniel Kahneman in Thinking Fast and Slow.
But it's more accessible, is it?
It's more accessible. It's probably more focused on issues around the inability of people to correctly interpret statistics, which is just, you know, a massive problem. If people understood statistics, you know, really understood statistics, we wouldn't have anti-vaxxers, you know. And I think it also addresses a lot of, you know, problems like the missing data problem, which cause all sorts of problems in interpreting data, where, you don't really, you don't have a sample of all of the different categories of people in the 2x2 grid, if you know what I mean. And therefore you make pretty fundamental errors in terms of your interpretation of the data, you know.
Brilliant. How you know what isn't so?
I think, you know, I think it's a great book for entrepreneurs to read, especially entrepreneurs who are operating in a kind of a reasonably quantitative market, you know. But a great book for any intelligent person to read and kind of challenge themselves with a bit, you know. And it addresses lots of the, you know, the strange things that we believe to be true but just aren't, you know. For example, there's a belief in basketball in the States in what they call the hot hand. And essentially what the hot hand means is that if I scored the last basket, I'm more likely to score this basket than I would normally be. And that's just not true. And the statistical evidence is there.
It's funny, I would have bought into that. I would have been, yeah, confidence is higher. Yeah, it's probably true. Yeah, there you go.
Turns out it's not.
Damn it. It's definitely going to have to read this. True. Where can people learn more about what you're working on or get in touch with you?
So I suppose Scale Ireland is probably
Scale Ireland.
The easiest place to track me down these days, you know. You'll also see me hanging around Dogpatch Labs. I'm on the board of the new NDRC there, so you'll see me floating around there. And you know, don't be afraid to come over and say hi.
So if they really want to hustle, that's what they'll get you.
Yeah.
Perfect. Brian, thank you so much for joining us.
Not at all. You're more than welcome. Thank you.
Hope you enjoyed my chat with Brian. To learn more about the Entrepreneurial Experiment, go to mrgaryfox.com. I'll see you back here next Monday for a brand new episode of the Idea Lab. See you then.